"Get back on that train, Miss Pritchard. I don't need you here, and I sure as hell don't want you." Those were the words Walter Wallace had said to her 3 weeks ago. She could still hear them ringing in her ears, cold and deliberate as a gunshot fired into still morning air. She had stood on the platform of Redemption Creek's tiny train station with her leather traveling case in one hand and a worn paper advertisement in the other, the ink barely dry from where she'd clutched it during the long journey west. She had traveled over 1,200 miles on iron rails and wooden seats, watching the lush green of Ohio slowly bleed into the vast, indifferent amber of the Kansas plains, telling herself with every turning wheel that this was the right decision, that this was the beginning of something real. And Walter Wallace had looked at her like she was a mistake someone else had made. He had been standing just off the platform, hat pulled low against the October sun of 1883, arms crossed over a chest that seemed built specifically to refuse things. His jaw was set hard. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and restless and absolutely unyielding. He hadn't even let her speak before he'd said it. "Turn around, miss. The next train back east comes through Thursday. I'll pay your fare myself." She hadn't turned around. She had squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and said in a voice that did not shake because she had promised herself it would not shake, "I came all this way, Mr. Wallace. The least you can do is tell me why," he had told her. In clipped, brutal sentences that left no room for argument, he had told her that he had not placed the advertisement, that he didn't need a wife, that the whole arrangement had been a mistake perpetrated by someone else, someone who had no right to make decisions on his behalf. He had said that he was sorry for the inconvenience of her journey, and that he meant no personal offense, but that she needed to understand she was not welcome at the Wallace Ranch. And now, 3 weeks later, Hazel Pritchard was standing in the mud outside that very ranch in the pouring rain, with her leather case split open at her feet, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth, because the roof of Redemption Creek's only boarding house had collapsed in the storm, and she had nowhere else to go. She raised her fist and knocked on Walter Wallace's door. She had arrived on the last train west 3 weeks before that knock, on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1883, when the Kansas sky was so wide and blue it seemed almost threatening, like something that big had no business being so beautiful. Hazel was 26 years old, and she had made a habit of doing things that frightened her because she had learned early that waiting for courage to arrive on its own was a fool's game. She had grown up in Marietta, Ohio, the middle daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had spent most of Hazel's childhood quietly disappearing into the wallpaper of their small house. Her father had taught her to read voraciously and to argue well. Her mother had taught her, without meaning to, that a woman who did not choose her own life would eventually find that someone else had chosen it for her. At 23, Hazel had taken a position as a telegraph operator in Columbus, which had been scandalous enough for a woman of her station. She had been good at it, quick and precise, with a memory for codes and a composure that did not crack under pressure. She had worked there for 3 years and had saved enough money to imagine, distantly, a different kind of life, a life with more sky in it, more purpose, more room. She had found the advertisement tucked inside a copy of the Columbus Dispatch in the spring of 1883. It had been modest and plain, nothing like the flowery notices that other men placed, promising romance and prosperity. It had read simply, "Rancher in Redemption Creek, Kansas, seeks capable woman of good character for correspondence and possible arrangement. Hard work expected. Honesty required. No false promises made. Respond to W. Wallace, Redemption Creek Post Office, Kansas." Something about the plainness of it had caught her, the lack of pretense, the honesty required. She had written back that same afternoon, a letter that was equally plain in which she described herself accurately. Average in looks, above average in competence, not given to fainting or weeping, comfortable with solitude, in possession of a good temper most of the time and an excellent memory always. She had said she was not looking for poetry. She was looking for a real life. She had received no reply. She had written again 2 weeks later and again received nothing. She had written a third time in July and still nothing. And then in August she had received a letter, not from W. Wallace, but from someone who signed himself as Tom Wallace, explaining that his brother Walter was not much for letter writing, but had asked Tom to convey that the arrangement was agreeable and that Miss Pritchard was welcome to come west in the fall, when the worst of the summer heat had broken and the ranch work had settled into its quieter season. She had believed it. She had given notice at the telegraph office, packed her life into 2 cases, and boarded the train in September of 1883 with the particular bravery of a woman who has decided to stop waiting. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Walter Wallace had never placed that advertisement. His younger brother Tom had placed it, without permission, without discussion, driven by the conviction that Walter was slowly calcifying alone out on that ranch, and needed someone to break him open before he turned entirely to stone. Tom had intercepted Hazel's letters, had written the reply himself, and had neglected to mention any of this to Walter until approximately 48 hours before Hazel's train arrived in Redemption Creek. The argument between the brothers had been, by all accounts, spectacular. Hazel knew none of this as the train rolled into Redemption Creek Station, and she stepped out into the October afternoon with her cases and her advertisement and her particular brand of quiet, iron-spined hope. She knew only that she was here, that this was the plan, and that the man in the dark hat watching the train from beside the water trough looked like he was preparing for a fight rather than a welcome. "Mr. Wallace," she had said, walking toward him with her hand extended. He had looked at her hand for a moment, and then he had looked at her face, and something had moved through his expression that she couldn't name, something that came and went so quickly she might have imagined it. Then the shutters had come down and he had said his terrible words, and the October afternoon had gone very quiet. She had not, in the end, gotten back on that train, partly because she had no money left for a return fare, and partly because something in her had simply refused to believe that this was how the story ended. She had taken a room at Miriam Cassidy's boarding house on the main street of Redemption Creek, which was a town of perhaps 400 people, a grain elevator, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, a church, and a post office that smelled perpetually of sawdust and old ink. Miriam Cassidy was a widow of 52 who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. She had taken one look at Hazel on her doorstep and said, "You must be the woman Tom Wallace dragged out here. Come in and sit down. I'll put coffee on and you can tell me how bad it was." It had been bad enough. Hazel had told the story plainly, the way she told everything, and Miriam had listened with the concentrated attention of a woman who has seen most of what life has to offer and is still interested in it. "Walter Wallace is not a bad man," Miriam had said finally, refilling Hazel's cup. "He's a wounded one. There's a difference. His wife died 4 years ago. Fever took her in the summer of 1879, and it took the baby she was carrying at the same time. Walter built a wall around himself after that and has been reinforcing it ever since. Tom's been trying to knock it down with everything he's got." Hazel had sat with that information for a long moment. "That's a terrible thing," she had said, "but it doesn't explain why he thought it was acceptable to speak to me the way he did." "No," Miriam had agreed. "It doesn't." Hazel had found work within the week. The owner of the Redemption Creek General Store, a round-faced man named George Albright, had discovered within 2 minutes of conversation that Hazel could keep accounts and operate a telegraph, and had offered her a position immediately. She had accepted, partly because she needed the income, and partly because having a purpose made everything more bearable. She had settled into a rhythm. She worked at Albright's store 6 days a week, learning the particular texture of Redemption Creek, its gossip and its grievances, its small loyalties and its petty feuds. She discovered that the town had a subtle, living geography, that certain people always stopped at the same corner to talk, that the men from the surrounding ranches came in on Saturdays for supplies and stayed too long and drank too much, that there was a women's sewing circle that met at the church on Wednesday afternoons and discussed everything except sewing. She also discovered that Walter Wallace came into town approximately once every 10 days, always on a weekday morning, always alone, always moving with the economical purpose of a man who has calculated exactly how long he can afford to be away from his work. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and an inch or two beyond, with the kind of lean, muscular build that came from actual labor rather than vanity. His hair was dark brown, gone slightly silver at the temples, and he was, she estimated, somewhere around 35 years old. He had a quality of stillness about him that she found simultaneously compelling and infuriating, because it was the kind of stillness that was not peace but rather control. He was not calm. He was contained. The first time he had come into Albright's store after she'd started working there, he had stopped dead in the doorway when he saw her behind the counter, and something had shifted in his expression again, that quick, nameless thing she had seen at the station. "Miss Pritchard," he had said. "Mr. Wallace," she had said. "What can I get for you?" He had placed his order with the precision of a man being very careful about something, and she had filled it with equal precision, and he had paid and left without any further conversation. But he had been back 8 days later, slightly ahead of his usual schedule, and this time he had stayed a few minutes longer while she tallied his account, and he had said stiffly, as if it cost him something, "I hope you're finding the town agreeable." "Agreeable enough," she had said, not looking up from the ledger. "I understand you're boarding with Mrs. Cassidy." "I am." A pause. "She's a good woman." "She is," Hazel had agreed. Another pause. Then, "I owe you an apology, Miss Pritchard. What I said at the station was," he had stopped, started again. "It was rude. You didn't deserve to be spoken to like that. The situation was not your fault." She had looked up then, studying his face with the direct attention she applied to everything. There was no comfort in it, she thought. He was not a man who let himself be comfortable. But there was honesty in the lines of him, in the set of his mouth and the steadiness of his storm-cloud eyes. She could respect honesty even when it came wrapped in difficulty. "Apology noted," she had said. "I'd prefer not to receive another one. So perhaps we should simply agree to behave like civilized people going forward." Something had shifted in his face then, something she thought might have been the ghost of a smile. "That seems manageable," he had said. It was not, of course, manageable in the way either of them had imagined, because Redemption Creek was a small town and proximity was its own kind of pressure. 3 weeks after her arrival, the storm had come in from the northwest with the particular savagery of late autumn on the Kansas plains. It had begun as a cold rain on a Sunday afternoon, and built through Sunday night into something wild and deliberate, with wind that bent the cottonwood trees along the creek into shapes that seemed impossible and rain that came in horizontal sheets that turned the streets to rivers. Hazel had been in her room at Miriam's boarding house when she'd heard the crack overhead, a sound like a pistol shot amplified to the scale of the world, and then the roof above the back section of the house had come down in a cascade of wet timber and broken slate. No one had been hurt, mercifully. But the boarding house was uninhabitable. Miriam's daughter in Abilene had been immediately telegraphed, and Miriam herself had gone to stay with a neighbor. The other 2 boarders, a drummer from St. Louis and a young surveyor passing through, had found space at one of the saloons. And Hazel had stood in the street with her split-open leather case and her soaked traveling dress, and the particular cold clarity of a woman who has just watched her options contract to almost nothing, and she had thought of exactly one place she could go. She had walked the 3 miles to the Wallace ranch in the rain. Later she would think that she probably could have made some other arrangement, that she could have slept in Albright's store or imposed on Miriam's neighbor, or found some third option that would have preserved the careful, painful distance she had been maintaining from Walter Wallace. But it was past 10 o'clock in the evening and she was soaking wet, and she was 26 years old and she was tired. And so she had walked the 3 miles in the dark and the rain and knocked on Walter Wallace's door. He had opened it and looked at her for a long, very still moment. She had looked back. The rain continued to fall. A lantern hung above the door, swaying in the wind, and in its light she could see that he was in his shirt sleeves, that his hair was slightly disordered, that he had been reading something because he was still holding a book loosely in one hand. "The boarding house roof," she said. "It came down." He stepped back immediately. "Come inside." She came inside. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, solidly built, with low ceilings and a central fireplace that was doing honest work against the cold. The main room served as sitting room and dining room together, with a kitchen beyond a narrow doorway, and what she assumed were sleeping rooms on the other side. It was furnished without much thought for aesthetics, but with considerable thought for function: heavy wooden furniture, good bookshelves, a work table along one wall covered in papers and maps, and the systematic debris of managing a working cattle operation. He brought her a towel without being asked. He put a kettle on without asking if she wanted tea. He disappeared into one of the back rooms and returned with a wool blanket and a dry shirt that was obviously his, and after a moment's visible hesitation, draped both over the back of the chair nearest the fire without comment. "My hand," he said, which she did not understand until he added, "My ranch hand. Martinez. He has a room in the bunkhouse. I'll sleep in the barn tonight." "Mr. Wallace, that's not necessary." "It is," he said, with the flat finality she was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of stubborn. "Entirely necessary. You'll take my room. I'll be fine." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to banish yourself to the barn on my account." "I'm not banishing myself," he said. "I'm being appropriate." "You're being difficult." He blinked. She thought she had surprised him. It was the most gratifying thing that had happened to her all day. "Miss Pritchard," he said slowly, "you're standing in my house at 10 o'clock at night in soaking wet clothes with a broken case." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm trying to help you." "I know," she said. "I'm trying to let you. I just don't think you need to sleep in the barn to do it." He stared at her. The wind pushed against the windows. The fire crackled. He said finally, "There's a daybed in the study. I'll use that." "That," she said, "seems perfectly reasonable." He brought her to his room, which was spare and clean and smelled of wood smoke and leather and something else. Something she couldn't identify, a faint botanical quality, as if someone had once kept dried herbs here and the scent had stayed. There was a good bed with a wool comforter, a washstand with a ceramic basin, and a single window facing the barn and the dark outline of the plains beyond. She thanked him. He nodded and closed the door. She stood alone in the room that smelled of him and listened to the storm battering the world outside, and she thought, well, here we are. She slept better than she had in weeks. Morning came in gray and exhausted after the storm, with a pale sun struggling through thinning clouds and the whole landscape rearranged, branches down, the creek running high and brown, the yard a complicated mud geography. Hazel woke early and dressed, having hung her wet things near the fireplace the night before, and found the kitchen. He was already there. He had coffee on and was making something in a cast-iron pan that smelled like bacon and cornmeal. He turned when she came in, and for just a moment the morning light caught his face before he had put his expression back in order, and she saw something raw and undefended in it, something that was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Coffee's ready," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I can take over if you'd like." "I've been feeding myself for years," he said, but without sharpness. "And doing it adequately, I'm sure," she said, settling at the kitchen table. "I just thought to offer." He brought the coffee to her first, which she noted. They ate breakfast in a silence that was, she thought, slightly different from the silences that had existed between them before. Less defended somehow, less careful. "I need to check the fence line on the south pasture after yesterday's wind," he said, pushing back from the table. "There'll be damages to assess. Martinez is already out checking the stock." "Would you like another set of eyes?" she asked. He looked at her. "It's muddy." "I've noticed," she said. "I walked 3 miles through it last night." Again, that not-quite smile. "I suppose you did," he said. "If you want to come." They went. She wore her sturdiest boots, and he gave her an old canvas coat that was far too large for her. And they walked the south fence line in the thin autumn sunshine, while the world steamed gently around them in the aftermath of the storm. He pointed out the boundaries of the property, explaining things about the land with the quiet authority of a man who has spent years learning to read it, which sections drained well and which held water too long, where the grass was richest, where the cattle liked to bunch in cold weather. She listened carefully and asked questions that were practical rather than polite, and she could tell by the slight shift in his posture when she asked them that he was recalibrating something in his assessment of her. "You've managed a household before," he asked, mending a section of down fence wire while she held the post. "My family's for some years," she said. "My mother was ill for a long time. Then I worked at the telegraph office in Columbus for 3 years. That's different work. Very. I like them both for different reasons." He was quiet for a moment, twisting wire with practiced efficiency. "What brought you to the advertisement then, if you had a position?" She considered the question. She had told herself it was about the West, about space and purpose and a real life, and all of that was true. But she was honest enough to acknowledge it was also about loneliness, the specific loneliness of a capable woman in a city full of people who were either indifferent to her or slightly intimidated by her, who had worked for 3 years in a job that used only some of her, and had spent evenings in a rented room reading books, and telling herself this was enough. "I wanted something that mattered," she said, "something real. A position on a ranch is real." He didn't say anything. She glanced at him and found him looking at her with that expression she was beginning to learn, the one that wasn't quite a wall and wasn't quite an opening but something in between, like a door that was neither locked nor unlocked. Tom Wallace arrived that afternoon, which was both better and worse than it might have been. He was 28, 7 years younger than Walter, with the same dark hair and strong build but an entirely different quality of face. Where Walter was contained, Tom was expressive, with quick brown eyes and a mouth that moved easily between laughter and contrition. He came riding into the yard and stopped dead when he saw Hazel standing at the corral fence watching Martinez bring in the horses, and his face performed several different emotions in rapid sequence before landing on something that looked like resigned relief. "Miss Pritchard," he said, dismounting, "you're still here." "I'm still here," she confirmed. "How mad is he?" Tom asked in a tone that suggested this was a routine calculation. "Currently managing it," Hazel said. "I'd tread carefully." Tom nodded with the particular resignation of a man who has been treading carefully for some time. He went into the house. She heard voices, Walter's low and even, Tom's more rapid and placating, and she made a point of staying at the fence until the conversation had run its course. When Tom came back out 20 minutes later, he looked like a man who had emerged from something intact but not entirely unscathed. "He said you can stay until Miriam's house is repaired," Tom told her. "He said it'll be 3 or 4 weeks probably, given the damage." "That's very generous," Hazel said. Tom gave her a look. "He's a generous man," he said quietly. "He just forgot it for a while." She thought about that long after Tom had ridden away toward his own property on the eastern side of the county. 3 or 4 weeks. She thought of the morning in the kitchen, the fence-line walk, the way he had brought coffee to her first. She thought of Miriam's words, "He is not a bad man, he is a wounded one." She thought that wounds, even very deep ones, sometimes healed, given the right conditions. The days that followed settled into a pattern that was, on the surface, entirely practical and underneath, something considerably more complicated. Hazel cooked breakfast in the mornings because she was up early, and it was simply efficient to do so, and Walter stopped objecting after the 3rd day. She helped Martinez with the supply records, which were in a state of productive chaos, and organized them into a system that Walter examined carefully one evening after supper and declared, in his particular way, useful. She read in the evenings by the fire. He read across the room from her, and the silence between them was warm and inhabited, nothing like the cold silences of their early encounters. He talked more than she had expected him to. Not chattily, not socially, but seriously and at length when he had something real to say, about the ranch, about the cattle market, about the particular challenges of running a working operation in western Kansas where water was precious, and weather was treacherous and the nearest railroad depot was 20 miles east. He asked for her opinion sometimes, which surprised her, and then did not seem surprised by what she said, which surprised her more. One evening, perhaps a week into her stay, she came into the main room after washing dishes to find him standing at the window looking out at the dark plains with his hands clasped behind his back, and an expression on his face that was the most unguarded she had seen it. He was looking at nothing she could identify, nothing visible out there in the October night, and she understood that he was looking at something internal, something that lived in him the way dark things live in still water, present even when invisible. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and he turned quickly as if she had caught him at something. "For what?" "For whatever you're thinking about," she said. It looked heavy. He studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Cassidy talked to you," he said finally. "It was not a question. She mentioned your wife and your loss. I'm sorry for that, Mr. Wallace, truly." He turned back to the window, a long silence. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Her name was Clara. She was 28 when she died. She had been on this ranch with me for 3 years and she had made it into something that actually felt like a home, and when she was gone, I couldn't," he stopped, "started again. I could not make it feel like that again, no matter what I did." Hazel did not say she was sorry again. It seemed insufficient to the scale of what he was describing. She said instead, "What was she like?" That did catch him off guard. She could see it. People, she suspected, had spent 4 years being careful with him about Clara, stepping around the subject gently, and no one had simply asked him to talk about her. He talked for almost an hour. He told her about how Clara had arrived in Kansas from Missouri as a young woman of 24, fearless and argumentative and deeply funny, with a habit of collecting stray animals and a complete inability to make decent cornbread, which had been the source of considerable marital negotiation. He talked about the way she had organized the ranch's finances with the systematic ferocity of a general planning a campaign, and the way she had planted a kitchen garden in the rocky soil near the house, and somehow made things grow there that had no business growing. He talked about the morning she had died, not graphically, not with the kind of detail that was self-punishment, but quietly, the way a man talks about something he has carried so long it has become part of the shape of him. When he stopped talking, the room was very quiet. "She sounds extraordinary," Hazel said. "She was," he said simply. "You don't have to stop loving her to let yourself live," Hazel said, and then held her breath because that was perhaps too much, perhaps that was overstepping. Perhaps he turned from the window and looked at her with those storm cloud eyes and said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "Tom said something like that once." "Tom's not wrong about everything," she said. He almost laughed. It was the closest thing she had seen to actual laughter from him, a brief, involuntary softening of his whole face. Then it subsided and he was Walter Wallace again, contained and careful, but something had shifted. She could feel it. The wall was not down, but there was a crack in it now, and light was coming through. Things progressed as they tend to between two people who are sharing a small, warm house during the early cold of a Kansas winter, with a kind of inevitability that neither of them spoke about but both of them felt. There were moments. A morning when they reached for the same thing at the same time, and his hand covered hers on the handle of the coffee pot, and neither of them moved for a beat too long. An afternoon when she was helping him sort through old cattle records, and she found a pressed wildflower inside one of the ledgers, clearly placed there by Clara, and she had looked up and found him watching her with an expression that contained grief and something else, something newer and more frightened. One afternoon in early November, Hazel rode with him to the north section of the property to check on a small herd that had been scattered by a previous storm. She had told him she could ride tolerably well, which was a modest assessment. She rode well, with the economy of someone who has paid attention. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on it, which was, she had learned, Walter's way of noting things that pleased him. The north pasture was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected, the long grass flattened by the season into a tawny carpet, the sky pressing down enormous and close, the smoky hills visible to the south like suggestions of something larger. They found the cattle settled along a creek bend, fat and unbothered. Walter counted them and made notes in his leather-covered record book, and she waited on horseback nearby, watching him work, watching the way he moved through the landscape as if he were part of it, native to it in the way that the cottonwoods and the creek grass were native to it. He looked up from his book and found her watching him and held her gaze for a moment that lasted several heartbeats longer than it needed to. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking." "About what?" She considered telling him the truth. She considered saying, "I was thinking that I understand why Tom placed that advertisement, because whatever you've built yourself into, whatever wall you've constructed, something is alive in there that deserves to be seen." She considered saying, "I was thinking that I haven't been this interested in a human being in a very long time." Instead, she said, "I was thinking about the ledger system. I think if you cross-reference the pasture rotation records with the cattle weight logs, you'd have a better picture of which sections are actually most productive." He blinked. Then the not-quite smile appeared. "That's a very practical thought. I have them regularly," she said. "I've noticed," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not about cattle records at all. They rode back in the late afternoon light, and the ride was quiet and easy and good, and she thought, "Whatever happens after this, I am glad I did not get back on that train." The complication, when it arrived in the form of a letter. It came to the Redemption Creek post office in mid-November, addressed to Hazel in a handwriting she recognized with the particular sinking recognition of the unexpected. It was from a man named Arthur Donaldson, who was a banker in Columbus and who had, for approximately 8 months before Hazel had left Ohio, been pursuing her with the determined optimism of a man who believes that persistence will eventually be rewarded. She had never encouraged him. She had, in fact, been quite clear. But Arthur Donaldson had apparently tracked down her general location through her former colleagues at the telegraph office, and had written to inform her that he was prepared to travel to Kansas to ask her properly to be his wife, and that he hoped she would consider the comfort and stability he could offer against whatever uncertain venture had brought her west. She read the letter at the counter of Albright's store and felt a complicated mixture of things, none of which was the desire to see Arthur Donaldson. Tom Wallace was in the store that afternoon, ostensibly to buy lamp oil, but actually, Hazel suspected, to check on things at the ranch by proxy, and he saw her face while she was reading and said, "Bad news." "Complication," she said, folding the letter. "From." She was not inclined to share the details, but Tom had a quality of sympathetic directness that made people tell him things. Within 5 minutes she had given him the broad outline, and he was leaning on the counter with his arms crossed and an expression of thoughtful seriousness that looked, she thought, remarkably like his brother. "You're not going back to him," Tom said. "It was not a question." "Of course not," she said. "Does Walter know about him?" "There's nothing to know. It's a one-sided situation." "Walter should know," Tom said. "Tom," she said, with measured patience, "your brother has not said anything to me that would make this man's letter his concern." Tom looked at her with the expression of someone restraining themselves from several things they want to say. "Hazel," he said, with the familiarity they had developed over weeks of careful friendship, "my brother looks at you the way a man looks at something he's afraid he wants. That man's concern is your situation, whether he said so out loud or not." She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She did not tell Walter about the letter that evening. She did not tell him the next day either. But she wrote back to Arthur Donaldson and told him, politely but with the absolute finality that she applied to things she was certain about, that she was not returning to Ohio, and that she wished him every happiness, but that she would not be accepting his proposal in any form. Arthur Donaldson arrived in Redemption Creek 11 days later. He was not a bad man. She wanted to be fair about that. He was a tallish, well-dressed man of 32 with decent manners and the specific confidence of someone who has rarely been refused anything important, who had clearly told himself that seeing her in person would be the thing that changed her mind. He came into Albright's store on a Thursday morning and stood at the counter looking both relieved to have found her and slightly alarmed by the actual Kansas surrounding him. "Hazel," he said, "you look well." "Arthur," she said, "I told you not to come." "I know," he said, "I came anyway." The conversation that followed was difficult in the specific way that conversations are difficult when one person is hoping for a different outcome than the facts support. Arthur made his case carefully and thoroughly. His position, his prospects, his genuine regard for her, the comfort she would have in Columbus, the uncertainty of her current situation. He was not cruel or manipulative. He was simply a man who had convinced himself of something that was not true. "Arthur," she said when he had finished, "I appreciate that you mean what you're saying, but I'm not going back to Columbus. I'm not going to marry you. I am very sorry if I was unclear about that before I left, and I'm sorry you traveled all this way, but this is my answer." He left Albright's store still convinced, she suspected, that he could change her mind with a few more days of effort. She watched him cross the street to the hotel and felt, underneath the weariness of the conversation, a clear and certain knowledge of what she wanted that she had not quite named to herself before. She wanted to stay. She wanted to stay in Redemption Creek. She wanted to stay on the Wallace Ranch, in that kitchen in the mornings and that main room in the evenings, and out on that north pasture on horseback in the flat, enormous, honest Kansas light. She wanted Walter Wallace to stop being afraid of what was happening between them. Walter found out about Arthur Donaldson's presence in town that same afternoon, because Redemption Creek was a small town and small towns had a highly efficient information network. He came into Albright's store at 4 o'clock, which was not his usual time and not his usual day, and the look on his face was the most complicated thing she had ever seen on it. "There's a man at the hotel asking about you," he said. "I know," she said. "He came to the store this morning." Walter was very still, and I told him what I told him in the letter," she said. "No," something moved through his face. He said quietly, "He came all the way from Ohio." "He did," she said. "I did not ask him to." "Hazel," he said her name for she realized the first time, not Miss Pritchard, "Hazel. Is there something between you and this man that I should know about?" She looked at him steadily. "Nothing that was ever real," she said. "His interest was genuine, mine was not. That's the complete truth." He absorbed this. "He can offer you things," Walter said, and there was something in it that was not quite surrender and not quite admission, something raw and reluctant. "A house in a city, comfort, security. I'm aware of what he can offer," she said. "I'm also aware of what he can't." "What's that?" she said, because she was 26 years old and she had not come 1,200 miles to be timid about things that mattered. "He can't offer me this, whatever this is. Whatever has been happening on that ranch for the past 5 weeks. He can't offer me that because that is specific to you and to me and to however much you're willing to let yourself want it." He stared at her. The store was empty. Albright had gone to the back room with the diplomatic awareness of a man who understands when to absent himself. The afternoon light came through the front windows and lay in gold bars across the wooden floor. "I told you to get back on the train," Walter said. "I remember." "I was trying to protect you from something," he said. "From me, from the kind of man I'd become." "What kind of man is that?" "Closed up," he said. "Shut down. Not someone who could give a woman what she deserves." She came around the counter, which she had never done before, and stood in front of him where she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "Walter," she said, using his first name for the first time deliberately, watching his face change when she did. I am not a woman who requires to be protected from difficult things. I am a woman who requires to be told the truth. Do you want me to stay?" He was silent for a long, suspended moment that seemed to contain everything that had happened between them since October, every careful conversation and every inhabited silence and every moment at the fence line and on horseback, and in the kitchen in the morning when the light was early and gold and he had brought her coffee first. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "God help me, I do." She let out a breath she had not entirely realized she was holding. "Then that is settled," she said. He raised his hand and touched her face very gently with the back of his fingers, the way you touch something you are not yet certain you are allowed to touch. And she leaned into it the smallest fraction, and he exhaled like a man who has been holding his breath for a great deal longer than one conversation. Arthur Donaldson left Redemption Creek on the Friday morning train, having had a second conversation with Hazel the previous evening that was, by her account, more gentle and more final than the first. She wished him well with complete sincerity. He left looking like a man who had received unwelcome information clearly enough to believe it, which was, she thought, the best that could be hoped for. Walter was at the station when the train pulled out. She was not entirely sure why he had come, whether it was to ensure that Donaldson actually left or whether it was something else, some form of showing up that he was still learning how to do. He stood a few yards away from her on the platform while the train huffed and departed and the November wind cut across the tracks. When the train was gone, he came and stood beside her and said, "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. She understood he did not mean sending men away on trains. He meant the other thing, the thing that had no precedent for him except a grief so large it had reshaped his entire interior landscape. "I know," she said. "Neither am I particularly. We can work on it." "Together," he said, and the word cost him something, she could tell, which made it worth considerably more. "Together," she agreed. The courtship of Hazel Pritchard and Walter Wallace was not like the courtships described in the popular novels she had read in Ohio, which had tended toward grand declarations made in drawing rooms by men who knew exactly what they wanted, and were only prevented from having it by circumstances rather than their own interior resistance. Their courtship was slower and more incremental and considerably more honest. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, and they talked about everything: cattle and weather and the complicated politics of western Kansas, where the Homestead Act had brought waves of settlers into conflict with established ranchers over water rights and grazing land, and the railroad was simultaneously the town's lifeline and its greatest source of uncertainty. They talked about her childhood in Ohio and his in Missouri, about his years of building the ranch from raw grassland into something viable, about her years at the telegraph office, and the particular loneliness of competence in a world that frequently misread it as coldness. She told him things she had not told other people, about her mother's long illness and the strange exhaustion of loving someone who was slowly becoming someone else, about the years of managing her family's household while her father taught school and tried not to see what was happening to his wife, about the specific grief of watching a parent disappear incrementally, which was different from sudden loss but no less complete. He told her things he had not told other people. About the year after Clara's death, when he had not been entirely certain, he wanted to keep doing the work of being alive, and the way the ranch had saved him, the brute insistence of daily work, animals requiring feeding and fences requiring mending and seasons requiring attention, regardless of what was happening inside him. About his complicated love for Tom, who had always known him better than he wanted to be known, and who was frequently right about things in ways that Walter found difficult to accept. "Tom told me last week," Walter said one Sunday, as they rode back from the north pasture, that placing that advertisement was the best decision he ever made and the worst one. Both, Hazel agreed. "He said he's sorry for how it happened." "He's told me that himself," she said. "I told him I wasn't angry." Walter glanced at her. "Are you?" "I was," she said honestly, At the beginning, not at Tom exactly, at the situation. At arriving somewhere I'd been invited and being told I wasn't wanted. She paused, but the situation resolved. It did, he said. They rode in silence for a moment, their horses moving side by side in the cold afternoon. Then he said, "Hazel, I want to ask you something." She looked at him. His face was doing the complicated thing again, but it was different this time, less defended. The crack in the wall was wider now and the light coming through was warmer. "All right," she said. "I know it's not conventional given how things started," he said. "And I know I made a poor first impression. Several poor impressions, probably." He looked at her steadily, and there was vulnerability in it that she suspected he was allowing deliberately, choosing it, making it a gift. "But I'd like to ask you to consider staying. Not as a practical arrangement, not because the boarding house needs repairs. But because he stopped, tried again. Because the house is different with you in it. I am different with you in it, and I'd like you to stay." Hazel Pritchard had traveled 1,200 miles on the last train west and been told she was not wanted and stayed anyway and worked a job she hadn't planned on and walked 3 miles in the rain to knock on a door that might have stayed closed. She had done all of it because she believed that a real life required the willingness to be in actual contact with real things, with risk and uncertainty and the specific vulnerability of wanting something badly enough to reach for it. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand in his, and held it for the rest of the ride home. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard in the way that Kansas winters are hard, with wind that found every gap in every structure and snow that could arrive without warning and make the 3 miles between town and ranch feel like a different kind of country. Hazel moved her belongings to the ranch properly in December, after a conversation with Miriam Cassidy that involved some frank discussion of propriety and Miriam's final determination that Hazel was a sensible woman and that what Redemption Creek thought of the arrangement could look after itself. They were married in February of 1884 in the church on the main street of Redemption Creek, in a ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks. Tom Wallace was there, looking so pleased with himself that Walter had told him, quietly, in the vestibule beforehand, that he was never to mention the advertisement again or Walter would find some form of appropriate revenge. Tom had said, with complete insincerity, that he understood perfectly. Miriam Cassidy was there, in her best dress, with the expression of a woman who has seen a thing come out right. George Albright was there and most of Redemption Creek was there, because small towns take their celebrations seriously, and a wedding in February was a genuine gift of warmth in the coldest part of the year. Hazel wore a dress she had ordered from the Montgomery Ward catalog in November, a deep blue wool that was entirely practical for winter, but which had also, she had privately thought when she'd chosen it, a particular quality about its color in relation to her brown hair and hazel eyes. She carried dried wildflowers that Miriam had preserved from the previous summer. She stood next to Walter Wallace at the front of that cold little church and made promises in front of the people of Redemption Creek and the plain-speaking God of the Kansas Plains, and she meant every word with the same precision and completeness that she brought to everything she chose. He held her hand throughout the ceremony. She felt his thumb moving very slightly over her knuckles, a private gesture invisible to the congregation, and she thought, this is the real thing. This specific, imperfect, hard-won thing. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon, through a landscape that had gone silver and white, and absolutely still under a bright February sky. The world was vast and quiet around them, and she thought, for the first time since she had looked up at the Kansas sky from the train platform 5 months before, that the vastness was not threatening. It was enormous enough to hold everything. Grief and history and the careful, frightened progress of 2 people learning to trust each other. It was large enough for all of it. That first spring on the ranch was a revelation. Hazel had understood the ranch in its winter dormancy, spare and contained. She had not understood it in its spring exuberance, When the grass came back in waves of green so vivid, it seemed almost aggressive. When the wildflowers appeared in the margins of the pastures with the triumphant improbability of color in a landscape that had spent months pretending it could only be gray and white. She planted a kitchen garden near the house, choosing a spot she had been eyeing since November, that received good morning light and had reasonable drainage. Walter watched her working in it on an April afternoon with an expression she could not read, and when she looked up and caught him watching, he said, very quietly, "Clara planted her garden there." She held still for a moment. "Should I move it?" "No," he said, and then, after a pause, "She'd have liked you." It was the most important thing he had ever said to her. She knew it and she thought he knew it too, and neither of them said anything else about it because some things are complete in themselves. She had taken over the ranch's record-keeping by that point formally, with an accounting system that she and Walter had designed together over the winter months, that tracked not just finances, but cattle weights and pasture productivity, and weather patterns and the cost efficiency of different feed strategies. Walter had initially approached her involvement in the business side of the ranch with the specific combination of appreciation and residual caution of a man who had been doing things his own way for a long time. By spring, he had stopped being cautious about it. He consulted her on decisions as a matter of course. She had opinions and she shared them, and when she was wrong she said so clearly, and when she was right she did not labor the point. Tom Wallace, who came to the ranch regularly, had once watched them disagreeing about the timing of a cattle sale with the focused intensity of two people who are genuinely thinking, and had said afterward to Hazel, when Walter was out of earshot, "I have never in my life seen my brother argue with someone and look that happy." "We're not arguing," Hazel had said. "I know," Tom had said. "That's the remarkable part." Summer came to the Kansas plains like a visitation, sudden and total, and Hazel learned a new kind of work, the hot, demanding, relentless work of a cattle operation in its most intense season. She was not fragile and she had never pretended to be, but she discovered reserves of endurance she had not previously had occasion to locate, and she found that exhaustion, the honest exhaustion of actual physical work, was deeply different from the kind of weariness she had known in Ohio, the weariness of a life that did not quite fit. She also discovered that she was going to have a child. She told Walter on a July evening, after supper, when they were sitting on the porch watching the dusk settle over the pastures and the fireflies beginning to appear along the creek. She had known for several weeks, having waited until she was certain, and she had spent those weeks carrying the knowledge with the particular privacy of a woman who understands that some things need to be held alone for a little while before they can be shared. He went very still when she told him. She watched his face carefully, because she knew what he was carrying and she had thought carefully about what his first response might contain, and she wanted to be ready to meet it honestly. He was still for a long moment. Then he turned to look at her and his face was so open, so completely undefended that she understood he had not been able to get the wall up in time, that the news had arrived faster than his defenses. His eyes were bright and she thought he was perhaps very close to something he would not ordinarily allow himself. "Hazel," he said. "I know," she said gently. "I know what you're thinking about." "I'm thinking about—" He stopped. He took a breath. "I'm thinking about two things at the same time." "I know," she said again. "Come here." He came and sat beside her, and she took his hand and they sat in the dusk watching the fireflies while he found his way through whatever interior territory he was navigating, and she waited without rushing him, because she had learned that this was what he needed and also that he would get there. "I'm afraid," he said at last. "Yes," she said. "But He looked at her and the brightness in his eyes was unmistakable now. "I am so, Hazel, I am so glad." She put her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat there while the Kansas night came in around them, enormous and warm and full of the sounds of a living summer world. And she felt, with absolute completeness, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He was careful with her through the summer, and fall in the way that a man is careful with something he is both profoundly hoping for and profoundly afraid of losing, which she found simultaneously touching and occasionally excessive. She told him more than once that she was not fragile, and he said more than once that he was aware of that and was being careful anyway. And she chose to accept this because she understood where it came from and because his particular form of care, which was practical rather than cosseting, which meant ensuring she had help with the heavier work, and that she rested adequately and that she ate properly, was not the kind of care she could reasonably object to. Miriam Cassidy came to the ranch in October to help prepare, and her presence was a comfort that Hazel had not fully anticipated. A woman who had been through the experience herself several times and who had the grounded reassurance of genuine expertise. Their son was born on the 8th of November, 1884, in the ranch house, in the room that had once been only Walter's and was now theirs, with Miriam in attendance and Walter in the next room doing a fairly poor job of not being frightened. The birth was difficult in the way that first births often are, long and exhausting and requiring of Hazel everything she had in the way of endurance, but it was not dangerous, and by the time the November dawn was beginning to show through the bedroom window, there was a living child in the world. Miriam brought him to Walter first, which was her decision, and which Hazel later said was the right one. She heard, through the wall, the quality of the silence that fell, and then a sound that she had never heard from Walter and recognized as the specific sound of a man encountering the limits of the containing he has been doing for years, the point at which even the most disciplined wall will not hold against something this large. He brought the baby to her and sat on the edge of the bed with the child in his arms, and his face was absolutely destroyed and rebuilt and entirely new all at once, and he said, "He looks like a Wallace." "He looks like a potato," she said, because she was exhausted and honest. Walter laughed. Real laugh, unguarded and complete, and she thought she had never heard anything so good. They named the boy James Elliott Wallace, for Walter's father who had died when Walter was 12, and for Hazel's father who was still alive in Ohio and who received a letter with the news and wrote back a reply so long and full of joy that it took 3 pages. Walter read it over her shoulder and said by the end of it, "He writes well, your father." "He was a school teacher for 30 years, Hazel said. "He had better." James was a loud and demanding infant who had Walter's dark hair and Hazel's hazel eyes, and an expression of thoughtful assessment that made Tom, when he first came to meet his nephew, say, "God help us all, there are 2 of her now." Hazel took this as the compliment she chose to interpret it as. The first year of James's life was the richest and most exhausting and most vivid year Hazel had known. The ranch continued its work with the unsentimental persistence of a working cattle operation. Seasons turning and cattle moved and market prices fluctuating and fence lines demanding attention, and weather doing whatever it chose. Hazel worked alongside Walter in all of it, adapting her involvement to what was possible with a growing infant who was, thankfully, healthy and vigorous and blessed with a capacity for observing the world from the comfort of his mother's back that allowed her considerably more mobility than she had expected. Walter was, she discovered, a profoundly good father in the way that sometimes surprised her, not because she had thought him incapable of it, but because she had not seen its particular expression. He was patient in a way that she had not expected from a man who was not naturally patient with much else, and he talked to James with the serious informational quality he brought to conversations with adults, telling the child about the ranch and the cattle and the weather patterns, and the way the creek ran differently in different seasons, as if the baby were a colleague who merely needed briefing. James received this briefing with great attention and no comprehension, which seemed to suit both of them. Redemption Creek continued its slow evolution through 1885 and into 1886. The railroad remained central to its life, and the cattle market remained central to the railroad's importance, and the weather remained central to everything. There was a bad drought in the summer of 1885 that hit many of the smaller operations hard. Walter had planned for it, partly out of the long experience of a man who has learned to read Kansas weather patterns, and partly due to the water management system that he and Hazel had revised together in the winter of 1884, and the Wallace Ranch came through it better than most. He hired 2 additional hands that fall, young men from the eastern part of the state, who were willing and capable, and who regarded Hazel's role in the ranch's management with the good-natured adaptability of people who have no strongly held prior opinions about how a ranch ought to be run. Martinez, who had been with Walter for 5 years, had accepted Hazel's presence with a similar pragmatism from the beginning, having concluded apparently within the first week that she was competent and fair, and that these were the primary relevant qualities. Tom Wallace married a woman named Ruth in the spring of 1886, a young schoolteacher who had come from Missouri to take the position at the Redemption Creek schoolhouse, and who had the specific quality of being able to manage Tom, which was both rare and valuable. Hazel liked her immediately and thoroughly, and Ruth and Hazel developed the kind of friendship that had the practical warmth of women who share a landscape and understand each other's particular situation. They met weekly when the weather allowed, alternating between the 2 properties, and talked about everything with the frank intelligence of women who have decided to waste no time on subjects that don't matter. The arrival of 1887 brought with it the news that Hazel was expecting again, which she received with an equanimity somewhat different from the first time, the equanimity of someone who has done a thing once and knows broadly what it contains. Walter's response was also different this time, the fear still present but quieter, subordinated more immediately by something that was simply joy. "Another one," he said when she told him, with the expression of a man finding something he had not expected to find. "Another one," she confirmed. "James will have an opinion about this," he said. "James has opinions about everything," she said. "He gets that from me before you say it." He had not been going to say it. He was smiling. He was smiling the full, unguarded smile that she had been watching develop over 3 years of marriage, the smile that had been there in embryonic form on that first morning in his kitchen, and had grown into something real and habitual and hers. Their second child was a daughter, born in August of 1887, whom they named Clara Ruth Wallace, Clara for the woman Walter had loved and lost, and in whose kitchen garden Hazel now grew tomatoes and beans, and Ruth for the woman who had become Hazel's closest friend and who was Tom's wife, and who cried uncontrollably when told about the name. Walter held Clara for a long time on the first afternoon of her life, and Hazel watched him from the bed, exhausted and content, watching the man she had chosen hold the daughter they had made together, and she thought of the platform of Redemption Creek Station in October of 1883, of the words she had not known would eventually mean their exact opposite. "Get back on that train, Miss Pritchard." She had been so glad she had not. Clara was a different child from James in every way that it was possible to be different. Quieter, more deliberate, given to long observational silences that Walter recognized and James found baffling. She had her father's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and something of Hazel's economy of expression, and she was from very early age the kind of child who, when she said something, said it because she had been thinking about it for some time. James, who was 3 when she was born and had been prepared for this event through months of Walter's informational briefings, accepted his sister with a lordly magnanimity that she would spend several subsequent years thoroughly dismantling. Miriam Cassidy, who had become in practice if not in name the children's grandmother, said of Clara at 6 weeks, "This one is going to run the ranch someday." Walter had looked at Hazel over Miriam's head, and Hazel had looked back at him, and they had shared the particular communicative shorthand of people who have been together long enough to have a whole conversation in a glance. The look said, "Yes, probably, and also, good." The fall of 1887 brought other developments. The cattle market, which had been strong through the mid-decade, began showing signs of the pressure that would eventually lead to the crash of 1886 through 1887, a combination of overgrazing on the open range, dropping beef prices, and the severe winter of 1886 to 1887 that had devastated cattle operations across the central and northern plains. The Wallace Ranch, being a smaller and more carefully managed operation than many of the huge open-range outfits, had not been as badly hit as some. But the pressure was real. Walter and Hazel spent the winter of 1887 to 1888 going through the ranch's finances with the concentrated attention of people who are taking a situation seriously and would rather face a hard truth clearly than a comfortable fiction that would cost them later. They sat at the work table in the evenings while James slept, and Clara made the small, determined sounds of an infant who is working on the project of sleep, and they went through the numbers honestly. "We need to diversify," Hazel said, on a January evening with snow coming in against the windows. "Cattle alone is too vulnerable. What about grain?" "The acreage on the eastern section," Walter said. "It's grass now, but it could be broken up." "Tom did that on 2 sections last year," she said. "He said the wheat yield was good." "Tom talks to Ruth about the books," Walter said, as if this were still mildly surprising to him. "Most people talk to their wives," Hazel said. "I know," he said, with the slight smile that the observation warranted, because he had come a considerable distance from the man who had stood at his own window in October, 4 years earlier, looking out at the dark plains alone. They diversified. They broke up the eastern acreage and planted wheat the following spring, which was more labor-intensive than cattle in some ways and less in others, and which added a layer of planning complexity that Hazel found satisfying to work through. Walter hired a man with grain experience, a former homesteader named Ellard who had worked wheat farms in Nebraska, and who had the specific depth of knowledge of someone who has been doing one thing seriously for 20 years. The spring of 1888 was also the year that Walter's relationship with Tom moved through its final evolution. There had always been something unresolved in it, something that had to do with the advertisement and with the years before it, with Tom's position as younger brother to a man who had, after Clara's death, become increasingly difficult to reach. They had worked it out in increments, in the way that brothers work things out, through direct argument and indirect silence and the gradual reopening of trust. One May afternoon, Tom and Walter were working together on a section of fence on the property line between their 2 ranches, which they maintained cooperatively, and Hazel had brought lunch out and then made a point of going back to the house. She knew they needed the space. Later, when Walter came in that evening, he was quieter than usual, but in a good way, in the way of someone who has set something down. "You 2 talked," she said. "We did," he said. "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I told him I wasn't angry anymore," he said, "about the advertisement. And," she said, "and he said he knew that. He said he'd known it for a while." Walter paused. "He said he wanted to say that he was sorry anyway, for how it happened, for not asking me." "What did you say?" "I told him that if I was being completely honest," Walter said slowly, "the thing I am most grateful for in my life is that he did it." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her with both arms in the full, uncomplicated way that had taken him time to learn and was now entirely natural. She felt him exhale, long and complete, the final release of something he had been carrying for years. "Me too," she said, against his shoulder. The years settled into each other the way the best years do, not without difficulty, but with the accumulated ballast of everything they had built together that made difficulty navigable. James grew into a boy who was his mother's intelligence and his father's seriousness, walking the ranch with Walter in the mornings from the time he was 4, asking the unending precise questions of a child who actually listens to the answers. Clara grew into herself, quiet and perceptive and occasionally alarming in the accuracy of her observations, and she and Hazel developed a rapport that had something of a partnership in it from surprisingly early. Clara sitting with her mother at the account books by age 5, with the patient attention of someone preparing to understand them. In the spring of 1890, Hazel discovered she was expecting for the third time, which she received now with the full, seasoned equanimity of a woman who knows what she is doing. Walter's response was the pure distilled version of what it had always been, the brief moment of held breath, the fear that was no longer dominant, and then the open, unhidden joy. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. "The ranch will need more hands eventually," he said. "We have time," she said, and meant several things by it. The third child was another boy, born in October of 1890, whom they named Henry George Wallace. Henry for no particular reason, except that it was a name both of them liked, and George partly for George Albright, who had given Hazel her first position in Redemption Creek, and who had, over 7 years, become a genuine friend to both of them. Henry was a large, cheerful, loud infant who arrived with an enthusiasm for the world that suggested he had been looking forward to it. And James, now 6, received him with the slightly overwhelmed acceptance of a firstborn who has already had his dominance successfully contested by Clara, and recognizes that a third front has now been opened. Clara, who was 3, kissed the baby's head with great seriousness and went back to whatever she had been doing. This was, everyone agreed, entirely characteristic. Miriam Cassidy died in the winter of 1891, peacefully, in her daughter's house in Abilene, where she had gone the previous fall when her health had begun declining. Hazel and Walter learned of it by telegram, and Hazel sat with it for a long time before she cried, because Miriam had been the first person to help her in Redemption Creek, the first person to see her clearly, the one who had said that first evening, "Walter Wallace is not a bad man. He's a wounded one." She had known. She had known everything, as women who have lived long enough and paid close enough attention usually do. Hazel wrote a long letter to Miriam's daughter saying everything that needed to be said, and then she went out to the kitchen garden in the thin winter light and stood there for a while, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her hands in the soil, thinking about the women who make it possible for other women to get where they are going. Walter found her there. He came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him. And they were there together in the garden where 2 women had grown things, and neither of them needed to say anything. The 1890s were the decade in which Redemption Creek grew into something more substantial than it had been, brought by the rail connections and the stabilizing grain market and the general westward momentum of a country that was still believing in its own expansion. New businesses opened. The schoolhouse got a second room. The church got a bell. A doctor arrived in 1893, a young man named Fraser who had studied in St. Louis and who had the particular courage of someone who has deliberately chosen the frontier over comfort, and who became over years a friend to the Wallace family, with the practicality that comes of caring for a family's health through births and illnesses, and the ordinary physical demands of a ranching life. James Wallace started at the Redemption Creek School in 1891 and established himself immediately as both the most informed and the most argumentative student Ruth Wallace had ever taught, which Ruth reported to Hazel with a mixture of pride and exasperation that Hazel received with complete understanding. "He argues the way you do," Ruth said. "Which is to say, he's usually right, which makes it worse." Walter taught him to ride properly that same year, which James approached with the methodical seriousness he brought to all skills, determined to understand not just the mechanics but the reasoning behind each technique. Walter came in from those riding lessons with the expression of a man who has been asked more questions in 1 hour than he normally encounters in a week, and who finds this more enjoyable than he would have expected. Clara showed no interest in riding as a sport. She was interested in the ranch's finances and in her mother's garden, and in an assortment of books that she consumed at a rate that required regular orders from the catalog. She learned to ride because it was necessary, did it competently, and redirected the attention saved by not being interested in it to other things. Walter watched her with the recognition of someone seeing a familiar quality in an unexpected form. He said to Hazel one evening, "She operates exactly like you do." "She operates like herself," Hazel said, "which happens to have certain overlaps." "Yes," he said, "exactly." Henry, by contrast, was interested in everything physical and nothing that required extended sitting. He was a rancher in the making in the most direct sense, drawn to the cattle and the horses and the outdoor work with the complete conviction of a boy who has never needed to be convinced that this is his world. By the time he was 5, Martinez had declared him the best natural horseman he had encountered in 20 years on the ranch, which Walter received with quiet pride and Hazel received with the mental note to ensure he also learned to read ledgers. In 1893, Hazel began teaching a monthly class at the church, working with the women of Redemption Creek and the surrounding area on basic bookkeeping and correspondence, the practical skills that she had found invaluable and that were often unavailable to farm and ranch women who had not had the particular combination of education and circumstance she had been fortunate enough to have. It began with 4 students and grew. By 1895, she was teaching 12 women on a regular basis, and the ripple effects were visible in the improved financial management of several of the smaller farms in the area. Walter supported this without reservation from the beginning, which she noted and did not take for granted, because she was aware that in 1893 this was not a universal response to a wife who wished to do things outside the household. He had in this as in most things the clear-eyed practicality of a man who evaluates things on their actual merit. "If they run their operations better," he said, "the whole area does better. That's good for everyone." "Including us," she had said. "Including us," he agreed. In 1895, 12 years after Hazel had arrived on the last train west, Tom and Walter Wallace rode the fence line together on a bright September morning, and Tom said, "Do you remember what you said at the station?" "When she first arrived," Walter said, "I remember everything about that day." "I was terrified," Tom said. "Watching you tell her to leave, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake." "You had," Walter said, "and you hadn't." Tom looked at him. "She saved you," he said, "didn't she?" Yes. Walter was quiet for a moment, looking out over the land they had both grown up on in different ways, the land that had been hard and indifferent, and also, over time, generous in the specific way that land is generous to the people who take the trouble to understand it. "We saved each other," he said. Tom nodded, satisfied. They rode on. Hazel was, that same September, sitting in the kitchen with Clara, who was 8 and had recently decided that she wanted to understand the difference between gross income and net income, and was applying herself to this question with the intensity she brought to all questions she had decided mattered. Henry, 6, was outside with Martinez doing something that involved considerable yelling and was probably fine. James was at school, where he would remain until he had exhausted every resource Ruth Wallace had to offer, which Ruth estimated privately would be another 2 years at most, after which she had told Hazel he needed to be sent to the college preparatory school in Topeka. Hazel looked at her daughter, this grave 8-year-old with her father's gray eyes and her mother's brown hair, and a mind that moved with the quick, precise quality of water finding the fastest route, and felt the particular fullness of a woman who has built a real life. Not a perfect life. Not a life without hardship or loss or the ordinary griefs of the years, but a real one, with the weight and texture of actual things. The kitchen garden and the account books and the November morning James had been born, and the August afternoon Clara had arrived, and Henry's enormous, cheerful entrance into the world, and the hundreds of evenings in the main room with the fire going and Walter reading, across from her and the sound of the planes outside, and the complete, inhabited peace of that silence. "Mama," Clara said, looking up from the ledger, "if we bought the Henderson section to the west, what would the net benefit be in 5 years, assuming the wheat yields held?" Hazel looked at her daughter for a moment. "Let's work it out," she said. They worked it out together, the 8-year-old and her mother, in the kitchen of the Wallace Ranch on a September afternoon in 1895, and the calculation was sound. And when Walter came in from the fence line that evening, he found the two of them at the kitchen table surrounded by papers with the matched expression of people who have arrived somewhere. And he stopped in the doorway and looked at them both with an expression that contained everything. Every year and every season and every choice that had led to this specific moment. "What are you two doing?" he said. "Making an argument," Hazel said. "For what?" "Sit down," Clara said, with the authority of someone who has been told her whole life to think clearly and has taken this seriously. "We'll show you." He sat down. She showed him. He listened with the complete attention he had always given to things that mattered, and when they were done he looked at the numbers and then at Hazel and then at his daughter and said, "That's a good argument." "I know," Clara said. Walter met Hazel's eyes over their daughter's head. The look between them was all of it. The train station and the storm and the door she had knocked on and the morning after and the careful weeks and the moment at the general store when she had said, "Do you want me to stay?" and he had said yes, and all the years since. All the mornings and evenings and seasons and children and difficulties and joys. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm glad you didn't get back on that train," he said. She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. "I am too." Outside, the Kansas evening was coming in across the wide plains, enormous and amber and completely unhurried, and the wind moved through the autumn grass with the sound of something permanent and patient. And in the kitchen of the Wallace Ranch, a family sat around a table in the light of the lantern, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that had been broken had been mended, and the life that Hazel Pritchard had traveled 1,200 miles to find was exactly, precisely, completely real. James came home from school, and the evening became the particular productive chaos of a household with 3 children, and the supper that needed making, and the animals that needed their final attention, and the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of people who belong to each other. Henry came in from outside sunburned and happy and full of a story about what Martinez had taught him, and Clara put the ledger away with the precision of someone who knows where things belong, and James began immediately to tell his father something he had read that day that he thought Walter would find interesting, and Walter listened with complete attention, as he always did. Hazel stood at the stove and listened to the sound of her house and thought of the woman she had been on that train from Ohio, afraid and hoping in equal measure, watching the world change outside the window from the green she knew to the vast amber she didn't. She had not known what she was going toward. She had known only that she was going. She turned from the stove and Walter was looking at her from across the room, over the heads of their children, with his storm cloud eyes that were not storming anymore, that had not been storming for a long time. He looked at her the way a man looks at the thing that is the center of his life, clearly and without evasion, with the full and unhidden recognition of what it is and what it cost and what it is worth. She smiled at him. He smiled back. And the Kansas evening settled around the house like something decided, like something that has always been true and was simply waiting for the right people to arrive at it. And the fire in the central fireplace did its honest work against the autumn cold. And the world outside was wide and patient and full of the particular stars that appear over the Kansas plains on clear October nights. More stars than the sky in Ohio had ever managed. A whole enormous country of stars. And Hazel Pritchard Wallace stood in her kitchen in the life she had chosen, and the life that had chosen her back. And she was, in the deepest and most complete sense of the word, entirely home.